Our second objective today in covering inclusive leadership is to actually explain what inclusive leadership means. This leads from the business case for diversity that we just covered, and now that we understand how important diversity is, this trickles in nicely into inclusive leadership. So, what then is inclusive leadership? Can we just throw together a mix of people and hope that we get high performance? Or what does this mix of people look like? Well, sure, you have some idea, right? They've surface level that you can see, but then you can't see deep level diversity, although you know already how to measure some of these things using certain tests, personality tests, value tests, and so on. So, yeah, sure, maybe you can try throwing together a mix of people, but as we just saw, the starting point differs depending on the culture. So, what is the right mix of people? Does our management team already have a good mix of people? Is that what it really is? Well, that's not what inclusive leadership is, although certainly that can be a step in the right direction to actually having the right mix of people in top management teams. Inclusive leadership, though, is not a leadership theory, but is in fact a way of leading. It assures that all team members feel that they are treated respectfully and fairly, are valued, and have a sense of belonging in the organization. So, in a sense, what you're getting there is that there are certain outcomes involved with inclusive leadership. But what we're trying to ascertain is what does inclusive leadership entail, sorry, right? So, yes, certain behaviors and actions could lead to employees feel like they're being treated fairly at work, feel like they're being treated respectfully at work, and so on. But how do we achieve that? What does it involve? And yes, you are correct if you're thinking it involves enabling some of the conditions we spoke about earlier, the enacting some of these enabling conditions for diversity that we just spoke about. If so, you're on the right track, right? It does mean enacting those conditions, but how we go about enacting those conditions is important. So, what we can do is to think about what are the specific actions leaders can take to be more inclusive. To arrive at some of these actions and to understand what these actions entail, researchers have surveyed more than 4,100 employees about inclusion. They have interviewed those identified as highly inclusive by their followers and reviewed the academic literature on leadership to identify 17 discrete behaviors. So, based on all of that, they identified 17 discrete behaviors, which they then grouped into 6 categories of actions. Let's take a look at these 6 actions. The first one is visible commitment. And you see the speech bubble here with the CEO or whoever this person is saying diversity is important. Visible commitment, right? So, yes, these leaders would articulate an authentic commitment to diversity, not just pay lip service to it, but actually challenge the status quo, lead by example, hold others accountable, and make diversity and inclusion a personal priority. The leading by example point is very important here, sometimes called role modeling leadership, something I published on, and you may find it if you want to read more about it or fall asleep to that reading, you can certainly access it online. There are numerous examples of leaders exhibiting visible commitment to diversity. And a good one is, of course, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, where he has really embodied that concept of leading by example to signal to his employees and to the external public that he cares about gender equality in the workplace. He publicly opposed discriminatory legislation in states like Indiana and Georgia, and even marched alongside his employees in the Women's March. So things like that and actions like that, it doesn't. That's just one example. But of course, we see some examples in the news, in the media, of others in senior positions showing that commitment to diversity, even if it's not in a march, it's just on an interview and publicly speaking about why this is important to them. Of course, that has to be genuine, and employees have to. It has to resonate with employees. They have to see those things being followed up by actions as well, right? So that's one, visible commitment. Two, humility, somewhat of a lost art, right? Where on in today's society and on social media, humility, I think, is this is just based on observations, of course, but it's persons who are modest about their capabilities, willing to admit mistakes and create the space for others to contribute, which, of course, aligns with what we know from servant leadership. The reason I'm just reflecting on the extent to which we see humility, I suppose, given that we're exposed to a lot of things on social media, humility is not one of them, right? And we often see persons instead boasting about their latest vacation in a fancy country or driving a fancy car and all these things that are very attractive on social media to portray a certain image and a certain lifestyle, right? So that's the only reason I was just talking about those general observations. But of course, from a leadership perspective, individuals who can admit mistakes and create the space for others to contribute, that sort of empowerment of employees and being modest about their capabilities would portray a certain degree of humility. And I'll give you some examples of that actually just now. Awareness of bias. Inclusive leaders show awareness of personal blind spots, their own blind spots. They are self aware, something we spoke about already for emotional intelligence, and that's why I covered emotional intelligence, as you will see again very soon. It helps us to understand what self awareness is all about. And we spoke about building our own awareness of emotions in the past, but what about our blind spots? And this is something I'll also ask you to dig a bit deeper into very soon. What are certain flaws in the system at work? Can we identify those flaws and can we identify our personal blind spots, right? These inclusive leaders tend to work hard to ensure meritocracy, which is, of course, people getting ahead based on accomplishments rather than perhaps age or because of other biases that creep into the decision making process and into the performance management process, which we know is very prone to biases because as human beings, we are all biased in different ways and to different degrees, of course. This aligns, awareness of blind spots does align to some extent with authentic leadership when we speak about self awareness. And the image here just portrays this guy at the top of the seesaw, recognizing that, hey, wait a minute, things are really stacked against my colleague here at work. You know, I of course have a clear advantage given the biases existing in this workplace, whereas she's at a severe disadvantage. Inclusive leaders also have this curiosity about others. They demonstrate this sort of open mindset and deep curiosity about others to listen without judgment. Again, this reminds us a bit of emotional intelligence because these actions involve seeking with empathy to understand persons around them. Seeking with empathy, of course, is something that we spoke about and we actually engaged in a couple of interventions in our last class with respect to mindful meditation and perspective taking. That is how we can build empathy and, of course, maintaining that open mindset to understand others and to listen without distractions. Again, something we spoke about last week. So here there's once again a clear overlap with the emotional intelligence constructs or dimensions that we discussed last week. Cultural intelligence, they are attentive to others' cultures and adapt as required. Of course, there are things like cross-cultural training that tends to be somewhat popular to help leaders understand differences and across cultures. I'm sure you're all aware of the infamous policewoman meme that we have circulating in Trinidad, where she was lacking that consciousness of even our local culture in this small country. And that's not to blame her, but of course, just to illustrate the point about when persons lack that awareness, what can happen. Now, it's now a meme, right? And I still see that meme being used up to today. So, yes, having that, seeking out others from different cultures to understand them, which again is something we'll follow up with in the next objective, how they can actually engage in improving their cultural intelligence. And finally, collaboration is one of those actions, right? Inclusive leaders empower others. They pay attention to diversity of thinking and psychological safety to focus on team cohesion. So empowerment again overlaps with servant leadership. These 6 categories of behavior are what can improve the perceptions of inclusive leadership at work. And of course, they are easier to explain and write, put on paper, put on a slide, and actually enact. When we move on to the next objective, we will see how we can implement this in very practical ways. But before we do so, I want you to think about how inclusive you are. So, with respect to all six visible commitment, humility, awareness of your personal biases, curiosity about others, cultural intelligence, and collaboration, how would you rate yourself in terms of your inclusive leadership? Before I get into that, maybe I should remove it so I don't distract you, right? I did say I would share some personal examples of the six characteristics, and I wanted to show some verbatim examples from the most inclusive leaders in the first instance to show how they were perceived, and maybe that can help you to better determine how inclusive you are, okay? In terms of sharing personal weaknesses, humility, and even visible commitment and awareness of biases, this was a verbatim quotation. This employee stated, the leader will openly ask about information that he or she is not aware of. In this case, it was she, right? She demonstrates a humble, unpretentious work manner. This puts others at ease, enabling them to speak out and voice their opinions, which she values. Right away there, that should show you some degree of humility, okay? And even an awareness of biases to say, well, let me try to involve others because I may not be aware of this particular area, and even humility, well, yeah, humility and that visible commitment to actually involving others is there. She'll openly ask about information. So I think that was such a rich example of it. So simple to enact, but that requires, of course, that's about three behaviors right there in this one verbatim example. Here's an example of learning about cultural differences. This leader has taken the time to learn the ropes, common words, idioms, customs, likes and dislikes, and the cultural pillars. Again, this is a very good example of somebody who is trying to improve his cultural intelligence. And by even taking the time to learn the ropes, I suppose to some degree it shows some commitment that, hey, diversity is important to me, as we just saw for visible commitment. This is another final example about, well, I'll read it and then you'll see what it is about. This leader leads a team of over 100 people and yet addresses every team member by name. That is even better than I am. I can't even accomplish that in my classes. This is crazy. Knows the work stream that they support and the work they do. So that, of course, indicates a high degree of curiosity because the leader is engaging 100 staff members by name while continuing to keep updated. It shows a high degree of curiosity about others. Who are you? The same question we ask here. What are you doing? And I know it. And I suppose, again, to some degree, showing that visible commitment to diversity in a sense, right? Here are some examples of what it does not look like. What do least inclusive leaders look like? Well, in some cases, they overpower others. So, for example, he can be very direct and overpowering, which limits the ability of those around him to contribute to meetings or participate in conversations. Here, there's a clear lack of humility, right? As you can see, and no collaboration at all. It's overpowering and being somewhat like a dictator. A next example is displaying favoritism. Work is assigned to the same top performers, creating unsustainable workloads. There is a need to give newer team members opportunities to prove themselves. So this is perhaps more a lack of collaboration and also not being aware of biases that exist in the workplace, where the top performers are the ones getting all the extra work. And I'm sure we've heard many stories about this at different workplaces where don't work too hard because then you'll get more work, right? And that, of course, is similar here. A final example is this leader can have very set ideas on specific topics. Sometimes it is difficult to get an alternative view across. There is a risk that his team may hold back from bringing forward challenging and alternative points of view. So by not being humble and aware of one's biases and perhaps not even showing that commitment to diversity of views, this leader here runs the risk of having everybody go along with him just to get along with him. And once again, that is severely problematic for effective decision making because we are not going to have contradictory views to refine those decisions, and they are susceptible to biases, of course. Okay, So having heard those verbatim examples from the very same study, to what extent do you think you are inclusive? We'll come back to that question, but let's see what people generally say. In this study, researchers examined two questions that sort of stood out to them over 10 years of administering 360-degree assessments. So what they gathered would have been 1.5 million raters describing 122,000 leaders. Again, I try to bring to class some of the very large-scale studies which would provide more robust evidence of these things. So what were the two items? Okay, the first item was takes initiative to support and include people of different backgrounds and perspectives. Okay, that clearly seems to measure diversity or inclusiveness from the part of the leader. And two, actively builds a climate of trust, appreciation, and openness to differences in thoughts, styles, and backgrounds. Okay, what does the graph show us? Well, it shows us, those who are the worst at valuing diversity. You see direct report ratings. Those are the direct reports to the leaders reporting how diverse and inclusive the leaders are. The self ratings are, of course, how the leaders rate themselves in terms of how effective they are in terms of diversity and inclusion. So, direct report ratings, the leaders' ratings themselves. Right. So, it shows us that those who are the worst at valuing diversity according to their direct reports tend to what? Overrate their effectiveness. These same leaders tend to rate themselves higher than their direct reports, but so they don't see it. They aren't even aware of their own blind spots, which is not surprising, right? Of course, they're not very inclusive. So they lack that sort of self-awareness, and they don't see that gap existing, and they think they are better than they really are. In comparison, we see that those who are the most effective, the direct reports tend to rate them highly effective. We see it closer to the 100, from around the 41st to 50th percentile to the 100th percentile in terms of how effective they are in terms of their diversity and inclusion. Their direct reports are rating them higher than they are rating themselves. Okay? So, what this essentially tells us is that those who are the most effective tend to underrate themselves. And this phenomenon, of course, is not limited to inclusiveness. You probably are aware of the term already. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which explains that particularly unskilled people are prone to thinking that they are more skilled than they are. Let's pause for reflection there, because I'm sure we all can think of examples of people like that. Persons who have no skills or abilities in a particular area, talking the most in that area, or being the loudest in that area, proclaiming that they are the most knowledgeable in that area, whereas the ones who are actually knowledgeable in that area may not, may be a bit reticent, may withhold information, may be a bit quieter, may not be as perceive themselves as being an expert in a sense. Okay, why am I showing you this? Well, what I'm trying to emphasize is that you might intend to be inclusive. You might even think you are inclusive. But there is a chance that your impact on others might be very different. Okay? So, we will get to that at the end for our final objective, because I don't want to leave you hanging there, of course, thinking that, well, if I am not as inclusive as I am, what can I do? I know the actions we just covered. How can I enact them? What can I do exactly, Paul? What are the implications here? So we'll run through that after this activity, because there is one activity I wanted you to do for today's class on inclusive leadership, and that is something called an IAT test, Implicit Association Test. The purpose here is to measure implicit biases or unconscious attitudes that you may hold towards different groups of individuals. This can help you to identify personal blind spots or areas where you thought you may have been very good at, but maybe you aren't as good as you think. If you do one test, this could take approximately 20 minutes, give or take a few minutes, and I would advise that you maybe try doing two tests. So let's take a look at them. IATs are used to raise awareness about implicit biases that may affect hiring decisions, promotions, or workplace interactions. So as you can readily see here, this is obviously important for us because we may not, if there are implicit biases, we may not be knowledgeable about them as we just explained. We may think we are not biased. I am not biased against certain demographic groups, but let's see, right? IIT tests, just to give you some sort of background on it, in medical settings, they're used to explore biases that may affect healthcare professionals and their decisions in hospitals and so on, how they treat, how doctors or nurses treat patients from different demographic groups because of these implicit biases. They even use in education, right? So my very context here, where teachers may have implicit attitudes towards students of different genders, backgrounds, races, and how these attitudes could affect their teaching practices and perhaps even student outcomes, which is of course very important, right? It has also been used to assess implicit biases that might influence judgments in legal settings. So this is of course three very important contexts here, right? Such as decisions about those who are guilty, sentencing, the use of force, right? The law enforcement and the extent to which you use force against persons of different demographic backgrounds. So as you can probably see, the IIT tests are highly useful to identify your potential blind spots, or perhaps you may think you're biased in a certain area and you're not as biased, or perhaps you're more biased than you think you are. And here are some examples of the tests that you can do. Religion, IIT, so you have the religion's IIT test, gender, skin tone, gender science, you have weapons, persons of different ethnicities like Asian, Hispanic, Jew. We have, of course, sexuality, age. There's even transgender. This is just a sample, right? You can scroll further down. I will post a link to this on our My Learning page so you can access it. And what I'm going to ask you to do, I didn't write it down here, but I'm going to ask you to try at least one of these. Ideally, I would like you to do two, and I want you to select one and an area where you think you aren't biased or perhaps you're least biased in. Okay? And the second one is an area where you think you may have some degree of bias. The idea is, as you'll see at the end of our class today, when we get to the student learning portfolio, I want you to reflect then on the results. To what extent did they align with your perceptions of your own biases, which is exactly what we were just talking about in terms of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay? So this is what I'll ask you to do for me, and that will be the end of this learning objective. We will move on to the third learning objective next on how to create that inclusive leadership culture in very practical ways.